hello and welcome. This episode we're doing a sort of spin-off episode, slightly smaller than our usual in the Forge. For this one, we're looking at 5 Tekken characters who deserve or could have a Tekken spin-off game that may be a different genre, maybe a similar sort of fighting genre, but we'll get into each one when we get there.
Absolutely. The world of Tekken has a lot of great characters, both within the main sort of Mishima story and also some of the extra characters. And here's some of the ones that we feel deserve to have a game that goes a bit more in depth into their background, to their story, and give them a bit more time to be fleshed out. And the main rule is that we don't want it to be in a fighting game setup like as Tekken or Street Fighter, but like another genre. So let's jump right in.
Yep, okay, so the first one, which I think a lot of people would expect, is a game about Yoshimitsu. He has arguably some of the most extensive lore in all of Tekken, sort of spanning multiple franchises. You know, he's been in Soul Calibur, he's in Tekken, he changes sort of every few generations. There's so much lore behind him with the swords that he owns. And we sort of wanted to get into that, so the idea was that this would be sort of an RPG, so like a role-playing game as Yoshimitsu. And we have written here maybe in the Meiji era in Japan, so sort of towards the end during like sort of the ninja and samurai sort of eras. And it'll focus on the Manji clan and maybe have some other elements, so we're talking sort of the exploration, the maybe the story behind the swords, the sort of exploration that you do, so traveling across Japan, sort of fighting as a samurai character, but this is Yoshimitsu, so we'd probably involve the sort of Soul Calibur sword in this story as sort of the main focus, I think.
Yeah, the Yoshimitsu blade, I think it's called. I think it's just called Yoshimitsu. So the idea being that it's obviously not in a world where there are cars and like really guns or anything like that. It's really that samurai era where you had these like noble, honorable kind of warriors that would protect areas or go to other areas for I guess missions given down by their like area ruler, if you like, their duke or their emperor type thing.
Like the feudal lords and whatnot. Yeah,
that's right, the feudal lords. And you're essentially, as Yoshimitsu, you're the ruler of, or the leader of this little clan that basically is like Robin Hood and his, and the thieves, and his merry men. Sorry, I should say the thieves are Alibaba. But yeah, Robin Hood and his merry men, and you basically are kind of stealing from the rich and giving to the poor and keeping some of the proceeds for yourself. And basically, this kind of rascal type character, but with also it's that your own like real honor system that basically has this sword that is basically the most valuable thing of all. Because of the way it works, and there's a storyline behind that might go a little bit into supernatural, because it's a little bit supernatural anyway, but it's really a way to have what I think could be a really cool samurai style RPG. I'm guessing elements of Sakura game might be in there too.
Yeah, so I think with Yoshimitsu's whole story, the whole idea behind the sword and how it's not the same character in every game might come into it. So I guess the story might start with sort of a character who may not have the sword to begin with, and then may end up sort of taking on the mantle of Yoshimitsu, or perhaps the story of Yoshimitsu has been passed down a long time, so people sort of view your character as maybe even like a legend, not necessarily as a real person. People sort of think maybe you're a mythological character because the name and the sword have been passed down many times, so your character may not be the first, and definitely obviously won't be the last, so it's like your character's sort of becoming more than a man, almost.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the way that I think could make for the best game. In line with Cyberpunk 2077 coming out though, and more recent iterations of Yoshimitsu and Tekken, you could also have like an RPG style Cyberpunk game with Yoshimitsu as this cybernetically enhanced individual, with chance for Dr. Boskonovich to come in, and also Brian Fury to have those kind of crossovers. That's something that could be done. So you can have a story based around that. which I think could also make a pretty good game. But my preference, I think, would be the Meiji era, kind of samurai era style RPG. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think with the sort of cyberpunk idea, it would work maybe better because that's kind of what Tekken is already. It sort of has a bit of a almost dystopian cyberpunk-esque backstory behind it, with all the corporations and all the lack of like stable government and all of the sort of cybernetic enhancements and whatnot. So yeah, I could definitely see a story set in the near future, or even just, you know, in the Tekken universe, which might not actually have sort of years set to canonize when this takes place. So it could be, you know, just set in the Tekken universe as is, but focused on Yoshimitsu's story behind the scenes. Either way, I think both aspects of the story could work really well. Again, I think I agree with you. I kind of prefer the sort of historical-based RPG based in the past, but I definitely think a cyberpunk game could work for Yoshimitsu as well.
I agree. Okay, so next character, another one that's been in the games for quite some time, is Lei Wulong, who of course is the homage to Jackie Chan, and comes as a Hong Kong detective. So in that sense, there's a lot of like types of game and genre that can be chosen, you know, to make it work. My preference is like a Sleeping Dog style, you know, like an open world Hong Kong. And you're a detective basically that has a particular case that leads on to other cases, and basically, you know, you have a sort of a kind of open world, you know, almost like that GTA, I guess, style where you can sort of do anything to get there. You might get punished, for example, for hurting innocents or whatever, like that might make you fail missions, but like other than that, you can, you know, drive any way and you just control it as like your Sleeping Dog GTA style character. What do you think?
Yeah, I think this sort of story with Lei Wulong would work really well in sort of the Sleeping Dogs or like Yakuza or even like Judgment sort of way. So you can really get into those sort of like brawls, but also still focus on the actual story and the sort of detective work that you end up doing. And I think the main focus of this game would also be sort of capturing Lei Wulong's sort of like personality. So he doesn't take fights that seriously a lot of the time. So, you know, you'd have a lot of you know, sort of maybe boss fights with triad like criminals who might sort of be trying to take the fight seriously with like a knife or something, and you get that sort of Jackie Chan aspect where he sort of you know, he assumes a stance and then pretends to fall over and still knocks them out or whatever it might be. Like that sort of aspect of Lei Wulong would be really good to capture in this sort of game as well.
Yeah, it's a great way to have a light-hearted element to it, as well as having potentially a serious underlying story. But basically have like a nice world, a nice map, with a bit of free roam, you know, vehicles and stuff like that. And he still has a gun that he shoots, but at the same time, like, you know, if you can, you know, a lot of the missions will obviously lead you down the path of more like kung fu, drunken master style fights, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's really where the game would shine, is sort of the brawls and the sort of actual detective work rather than the like open world that you could mess around in. But yeah, it'd definitely sort of be a bit more focused. Might be a smaller map than say GTA, because that's pretty huge. It would probably be sort of more like a Yakuza or Judgment sized map, or even Sleeping Dogs. It'd be more like, I had Sleeping Dogs envisioned, map size, but also in terms of like, you know, it's just a bit more contained, you know, in sort of Hong Kong City, if you like, without needing to be, you know, massive, because it's not going to be about that. It's going to be a bit more story and character driven. Is my goal for that one. Yeah. So on to the next one. We thought King. So the original King, not the second iteration, or Armor King, or the second iteration of Armor King even. Just the original King, as sort of the young King in sort of the 1980s, building his reputation in Mexico as sort of like a luchador. And it can involve like cartel members or wrestling as the element, but probably I think it would probably focus on sort of the wrestling and how he sort of built his name and became sort of like the best, and qualified himself to compete in the Iron Fist tournament so that he could earn money for like the orphanage that he was trying to build up. But and I think that is like the cartel idea would be, you know, just like some of the subsets to, like, you know, to throw some of the matches and, you know, whatever else, like, you know, there'd be an obstacle to you if you don't sort of play ball to a certain extent.
but you don't have to have that as a big thing. My goal is not to have this as open world at all, but be more of like a linear path game, which is really just focused on storytelling and it reminds me, I guess, that my vision for this one is, or what I would have for that and what I would do for that is a bit like the old school Spider-Man games, in the sense that like you have like a certain area that you can go through, and you can go a bit further to the right or the left. You don't have to go straight down the middle, but basically it's pretty much set, right? Like, so you have to, I don't know, in between the fights, whatever mission or story parts that you have, that you basically can only walk from A to B, more or less. And basically my idea is to more focus on the fact that he's a wrestler with wrestling, and it's more sort of technical fighting if it comes in, but it's also telling a story of what life is like growing up an orphan in Mexico as well. So there's a few tugs of the heartstrings as well.
Yeah. I think this one will be a pretty sort of a pretty obvious one, because I think a lot of people really like King, and there's a lot of room to sort of grow his character, because he sort of has the outlines of his backstory, but there's nothing like, there's a lot of wiggle room for us to sort of create our own stories around King. So I think he'd definitely work really well as a spin-off game.
Well, there's a lot of unknowns with who he is and other things as well. And then you can actually do this in a couple of ways as well, by the way. So you can do it in a slightly supernatural way, in a sense that the games sort of make it look like he's got he's actually part Jaguar, which is silly, but like they use the masks obviously anyway in Mexican wrestling, and the masks have a lot of meaning. Like, you don't reveal your face unless you've lost, like in a mask of mask contest. So you can just have it as like a Jaguar mask, if you look at like Japanese wrestling, for example, you've got like tiger mask, it's just a mask, a normal mask that's made to look a bit more like a tiger. So you can have that here, and you can have that be a factor as well.
Yeah, and I think, as with a lot of the Tekken games, as he's fighting, there's still a little bit of that mystery, because you can tell that sort of the Jaguar head doesn't move, but when he does certain attacks, you hear an actual sort of Jaguar like roar, or like whatever it might be called.
And there's a random tail.
And there's a tail, so who knows? There'll still be room to sort of wiggle around that and have mystery there. But I think that'll be a good idea for
that's right. I think this one would be like a G or a U or a Gen, like a all-age kind of game, really, rather than, probably the first two that we talked about would be more like 15 and over in terms of style and everything else, whereas I feel like this one would be one that, kids could play as well.
Yeah. So the fourth one is sort of about Paul Phoenix as the main character, but a lot of other characters will sort of be implemented. And this is sort of, I guess, a sort of a prequel in the same way that the King one is to the Tekken games, where you sort of see the backstory of Paul Phoenix, his life initially as sort of a nomad biker who learns sort of judo at a high level and befriends martial law, and then fighting in tournaments and at bars, and ultimately fights against Feng Wei with law, and has to sacrifice himself there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, it'd be a story where you can have it, rather than being truly open world, you could, but it would be, again, a case of there might be elements of riding the bike around the city or around the highways and getting into trouble at, various biker bars, and just like generally the story of Paul, as this sort of semi-loner kind of guy that ends up befriending martial law to the point where he wants to help him open his dojo, and then basically the end being, the fight with Law versus Feng Wei, where Paul kind of comes in and sacrifices himself in order for Law not to get sort of destroyed by Feng Wei, basically.
Yeah, so I feel like this one, in a similar sense to the King one, it's a lot of sort of wiggle room with the backstories of these characters, letting us sort of explore parts that may not have been entirely explored in sort of the cutscenes if you win the Tekken games as them. So this will be, very much focused on these characters and sort of fleshing out the time that they had before the Tekken game stories sort of start to take place. And then also, obviously, the fight with Feng Wei sort of happens during the Tekken games, so it would sort of lead into that, but we'd probably avoid the King of Iron Fist tournaments themselves, because obviously that's main series content, whereas we're sort of trying to tell a different story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not completely necessary to have them to tell this story, but yeah, I think the idea is you're going through his life basically, and yeah, it's just a good way to sort of get in various elements to a game. I think, probably again a linear story rather than open world for this one.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So, do you want to talk about the final one?
Yeah, here's definitely one. So, for me, I'd always been interested in the backstory of Ogre, or true, whatever you want to call it, ancient Ogre, or whatever it is that you want to call it, the green-looking one, the Aztec one, because really, it's kind of said without being said, he's an alien, right? Like, he's not a god, like, that is an alien, like, that it seems to be. I feel like it is, but it's also like loosely kind of, it's kind of a loose reference back to the Predator, I think, actually, as well, in movies, the Yautja, as they nerds call them, basically, worshipped by the Aztecs, or the Mayans or whatever, as like a god and the god of combat, but basically it's an alien that's come from outer space. And I think there's some real elements to have a good sort of game and a bit of a story going on there, where maybe he was cast out by his race, or you can have almost like superhero elements to it, that maybe in the Mayan times or the Aztec times, like he performed heroic feats to like get the adulation of the people, or like just basically took on the world's, or even the galaxy's toughest fighters. And then basically another sort of backstory where you can either change it completely and have him as not even the actual ogre, but another member of that race, if you like. But basically, it's, I think, a really good way to get like almost like a superhero style game in there.
Yeah, and you can sort of, I do like the idea of him sort of earning the deity status that he was sort of granted by the ancient like Aztec and Mayan people by like, performing heroic deeds, or sort of being more like a, starting as more like a demigod, which he sort of is. Like he's not an actual god. He's an alien. So he starts off by beating, by sort of helping them, earning this sort of god status, and then eventually coming to the current day, you'd hopefully, after the events of the game that we'd create for him, it would sort of show why he did what he did in the games that he's in. So sort of why he ends up fighting and killing like Jun Kazama, and why he goes around fighting the greatest fighters, and that sort of thing. Again, sort of just fleshing out him as a character rather than just being the big sort of villain of the games that he's in. We want to see why he goes around fighting people, why he was considered a god, what else can we explore in his story that hasn't been fully explained yet.
Yeah, and like I said, it reminds me, if he's an alien, it reminds me a lot of like the Predator.
Yeah.
In the sense that they are also only after like honorable or worthy foes, and so you have that, but that might be part of like a leveling up system in the game, where basically for him to grow, get bigger, stronger, faster, all the rest of it, like maybe he has to defeat an equal and worthy opponent. Maybe that's part of like this level up system that you can put into that sort of a game. But it'd be a really good game to have a bit of a story in there, but really it's still about sort of fighting bosses and having tough fights, but really just expanding on a backstory.
Yeah. So that was sort of the last main one we had, but I have kind of a couple of honorable mentions, as we talked about in the Paul Phoenix one. I wanted to sort of mention that Feng Wei and martial law, so I'll go with Feng Wei first. I feel like his sort of backstory would also make for a really good story, similar to Ogre, in that his backstory is literally just defined as he sort of defeated his God Fist master at his dojo, became the new God Fist master, but knew that there was sort of hidden God Fist scrolls around the world at different dojos, so he would go around beating them and claiming their scrolls so that he could learn more about God Fist and essentially perfect the art. So I feel like that would be a super interesting story to do in the same way as Ogre, in that you could sort of just have an excuse to go around beating these different bosses and claiming their scrolls. And I think in this one, if there was a game for Feng Wei, you'd sort of be able to choose which one you want to pursue next. So it would be, not necessarily like an open world game, but it would be like you could sort of choose the path you take. So you could choose which dojo you want to tackle first, and then go to that one and defeat them and claim their scroll, and eventually lead to sort of like your final missions, as it were.
It sounds a lot like the old Pokemon games on Game Boy. Going around
almost,
fighting the the Pokemon
like the
masters, and taking Pokemon. It sounds a lot like that, but it's obviously a setup that works.
Yeah, and then the other one, obviously, martial law. Again, we mentioned him in Paul Phoenix's story, but I feel like he could have one during his sort of restaurant owning phase, where you could probably be sort of the manager of said restaurant. Directing your employees, trying to keep the sort of clumsy and like fighting nature that martial law has in check, because obviously we've seen in a few cutscenes he drops plates or kicks out rude customers or whatever by fighting them. I feel like it's a pretty funny setup for a potential sort of almost comedy game, really, centered around him sort of running his restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that one could probably translate well into like a mobile game, even.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to have like hugely strong graphics or anything like that. Could be something like that. But yeah, I think that's a good concept, and obviously a great character who is also like honoring the great Bruce Lee as well. So would make it a really good story. I mean, I would also want to mention that there's a potential for, I think, quite a good like Brian Fury game, because you've got someone that's obviously already like basically half cyborg. So there's a lot of scope to make a game on someone like that, whether it be like another sort of cyberpunk set game in a Deus Ex type world, or as like a I guess a cybernetically advanced like assassin, which he kind of worked as. Obviously in the backstory of Tekken, or in the side story, he's got like a lot of a feud going on with like Yoshimitsu. Like, I probably, if I was to make a Brian Fury game, I wouldn't bring in that. I would probably do it completely set away from like Tekken universe, really. Maybe the only one that I would allude back to is like the character from Tekken that basically created Brian, or like worked on him. But apart from that, like I just set it almost in like a different universe, to be honest. But the same character, but different universe.
Yeah, because I feel like if you're playing Brian Fury, you could almost have a game that's kind of like in GTA 5, you get a lot of enjoyment, or at least I do, from playing Trevor, and literally just being sort of the insane character who just kills stuff and doesn't have to feel bad about it. So I sort of feel like if you did a Brian Fury game, it would work really well to sort of be that sort of unhinged character who may not take the most heroic path through the story, and you sort of get into these situations where you sort of just have to destroy and kill people to get out of it. And I think that would work really well playing as Brian Fury.
Yeah, I mean, you either do it that way, or you have it in like a cyberpunk setting where you're not the only like cybernetically enhanced person, like in like a Deus Ex type world where there's multiple. So it just levels the playing field a bit more. And means that maybe like for example, he could work as a character in that same universe, if that makes sense, like in the same Deus Ex type universe.
Yeah.
So I just think that has potential. Before we sign off though, is there one, like, out of all of these, if we could get one made, is there one that you would pick above the others?
It might be slightly biased, but I honestly think the story based around King's past would really be my favorite one. I'd really love to see sort of an expanded history to King, and potentially, if there was a chance, moving that on towards sort of his past with Armor King, and then the eventual turn into the second King and the second Armor King, and all that sort of story. Just I personally think that's my favorite sort of like side character story that isn't related to the Mishima family. So I would really love to see sort of a King game that's expanded his story personally. But what about you? Is there one that you would definitely love to see made?
Yeah, I think the one that stands up above the rest is probably Yoshimitsu for me. Yeah. I think for like setting it as an RPG would be the perfect way to do it as well, with leveling up and changing things and having that sort of control. You don't even need to, again, if you're setting it in that sort of, older era of the samurais, like, you don't need to bring in any of the Tekken, like, characters apart from maybe, like, Kunimitsu, depending on how you have that, like, whether Yoshi, like whether the whole Manji clan are just eternal or whatever it is, or whether it's just Yoshimitsu that is because of the blade, is another story. But you can sort of introduce that as a story, and have this sort of second in command, Kunimitsu, that gets a bit more selfish and opposes you, or you can have a story of like some other like amazing samurai or whatever it is from that era, and I think have a really good story, but also in a really nice, beautiful open world. Like imagine like samurai era Japan in open world form, like in a massive map, where you can go from like ancient Kyoto to like some of these other places. I think it would, like Mount Fuji, for example. I think it would look really beautiful as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That would have 100% been my second pick. I think there's just so much you could do with that story. Going from possibly not actually being the Yoshimitsu character, like so you might not have the sword to begin with, to eventually sort of earning your place as one of the sort of legendary wielders of that blade, I think would be a really, really cool story to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, if you guys let us know what you think, we'll in the comments just comment which one you would like to see. We might make a video about the same length as this one, I think, just based on what we would do if we were to make one of those games as well. And to go a bit more in depth, if you want, give us some. Yeah,
we might be able to take one of these ideas fully into the Forge and properly write up a potential story for it and really expand upon our original ideas here.
Or if we've missed any out that you would put in, then let us know. As I said, we deliberately left out the main like Mishima stories and characters, because I think they are the ones that are most expanded on anyway. And we probably know what could be done with those. We wanted to really go into some of the side characters and the less lower level backstories and stuff.
Yep. Well, apart from that, I think that's everything we had for today. So, if you enjoyed, make sure you like, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we'll see you for the next one.
See you around.